Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Friday, April 8th. I'm Donna Will, Professional Development Coordinator for the Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to DDA's webinar on self-directed services and budget sheet and modification updates. On the panel today, we have Kristi Culbreth, Statewide Coordinator of Self-Directed Services, and Rhonda Workman, Director of Federal Programs and Integrity. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options for listening to the webinar by computer and phone, and if you have trouble hearing, you can try switching by clicking on the appropriate button on the webinar panel in the audio section. There is one handout for this webinar, and you can find that in the handout section in the panel to the right, and they can also be emailed if you are listening by phone. We are recording the webinar, and the recording can be accessed on YouTube and the DDA website. So now I'd like to introduce Rhonda Workman.
Great, thank you, Donna, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. Donna, can you go to the next slide, please? As Donna said, my name is Rhonda Workman, and Kristi and I want to thank you for joining us today as we look at self-directed services updates. On the slide now is our agenda for today's discussion. First, we will begin with our webinar purpose. We will have an overview, a brief overview of person-centered plans and budget allocations. Then we're going to share some information about the self-directed services budget sheet updates. Then we're going to start to talk about the DDA COVID budget modification updates. Kristi's going to walk us through an example of completing the COVID budget modification form, and then we'll open it up for questions. And as Donna shared, this webinar is being recorded so that you can review the information again if you'd like, and so that others who were unable to join us today can also have the opportunity to hear the information. Next slide, please. On this slide is our webinar purpose. And our purpose today is to share updates to the self-directed budget sheet, including the addition of a dedicated line item for backup staff taxes, dedicated lines associated with personal supports, overnight supports, and dedicated boxes that will be used to indicate the DDA budget allocation, the self-directed budget sheet total, and also calculate unallocated fund total. And we'll also be talking about the Appendix K budget modification, the DDA form number 5 that we've been using for the last couple of years. We'll share some updates and guidance on how to access any unallocated DDA self-directed services funding that is not currently in the self-directed budget sheet to meet assessed health and safety needs. Next slide, please. On this slide, we have a few visuals to provide an overview of the person-centered plan and budget allocation process. People with the support of their team create a person-centered plan, or PCP, based on their life goals, supports, resources available, and also unmet assessed needs. When people meet with their teams to make a person-centered plan, they begin by identifying their goals, the things they want to achieve or do. They then work with the team to see if there are any natural supports in their community that can help to meet those goals. Once they've looked at the supports they currently have and their community and natural resources, the team is then able to identify unmet needs for what DDA supports may be able to support. Those services are all explained and noted in the PCP and listed in the LTSS Maryland database, for which the coordinators of community services or case managers use during this process. Participant agreements under the self-directed model can be used to create and bring a team together to support the participant and to consider potential conflict of interest among team members or use of family staff. When the plan reflects and supports the person's goals, natural community supports, and assessed need for DDA funded services, it is then submitted to the DDA for review. The DDA approved person-centered plan service authorization includes the specific DDA funded services, the specific funding per service, and also creates a total budget allocation. The DDA approved budget allocation is then used by the participant to create a self-directed budget specifically that aligns with the person-centered plan authorized services and also to stay within the total budget allocation. Based on the person's decisions for the use of employees and employee wages, benefits, vendor rates, and other decisions, they may not allocate or use all of the DDA budget allocation. Funding that are not allocated in the self-directed budget sheet are considered authorized unallocated funds. Next slide, please. Now, just to touch briefly on budget responsibilities. After the PCP and the self-directed budget sheet is approved by the DDA, it is sent to the fiscal management service provider that the participant has selected. The person, with the support of their team, is responsible for approving timesheets and vendor invoices for the approved services in their plan. The team receives a written statement from their fiscal management service provider of all the funds and expenditures that have occurred based on approved line items. The person, with the support of their team, review that budget statement monthly to ensure that they do not exceed or overspend their budget. Next slide, please. So in terms of person-centered planning that we just talked about, a couple things also to review. Participants with new or changed assessed needs can request services or revise PCP during that person-centered planning process. Annually, participants' person-centered plans shall be reviewed and updated to meet new or changed assessed needs, which also then establishes their annual budget allocation. Some participants may have completed 2 annual person-centered plans over this COVID public health emergency to include incorporating services and supports since the beginning of the public health emergency to meet their needs now under their current plan and goals. As per our current practice, it's important to remind everybody that if there is an urgent service need, this should be reported directly to the CCS, or the Coordinator of Community Services, or the DDA regional office, and an emergency revised person-centered plan can be created. Next slide, please. This is a screenshot of the self-directed service budget sheet that was issued March of last year. It is used to note the PCP authorized services, the selected wages, benefits, vendor rates, and etc. that the participant chooses under their employer authority. It also includes information related to the approved DDA budget allocation and a total amount of the self-directed budget sheet. Next slide, please. So with that March self-directed budget sheet, we have updated and issuing it today to note 3 specific changes. The first one is an update to the budget sheet to add an additional line to note backup staff taxes. So you'll see on this screenshot of the newly revised budget sheet that we have updated to add information related to taxes. Also on this slide is a link to the new revised self-directed budget sheet, revised effective today. Next slide, please. The second update to the self-directed budget sheet is the addition of 3 dedicated lines for personal supports, overnight supports. You may recall that Deputy Secretary Hsu and Deputy Secretary Simons issued a joint memo regarding an update to personal supports, overnight supports policy. Waiver participants with an assessed need for personal supports, overnight supports, must demonstrate there is a behavioral or medical risk that requires overnight supports. And this information is then documented in the participant's current person-centered plan and approved nursing care plan and/or behavioral plan as applicable. We've also included on this slide the links to the memo that was issued, in addition to a link to the personal supports policy that was updated as a result of that decision. Next slide, please. The third update to the self-directed budget sheet is the addition of dedicated boxes associated with funding, including, first, the approved DDA budget allocation, reflected here on this screen with the blue arrow with an A. Second, the self-directed budget total, reflected here in our visual on the screen with a blue arrow with a B in it. And then third, unallocated fund totals, reflected here on the screen with a blue arrow with a C in it. This slide includes those arrows to show you how each of these figures are noted on the updated budget sheet. As with the current budget sheet, the approved DDA budget allocation is noted in the designated box. For this screenshot, we noted that the DDA self-directed services budget allocation total of $60,000. Again, the participant, with the support of their team, then enter information regarding the authorized services, their employee wages, benefits, and vendor rates directly into the budget sheet. The budget sheet will automatically add up all the costs and now reflect in the box referenced as self-directed budget total. You may recall on the current form, this amount is noted above the words check form. For example, on our screenshot, the total self-directed budget sheet came to $48,000. In addition, the updated form will now automatically subtract the total self-directed budget total from the budget allocation to determine the unallocated funding, which will be noted in the next box referenced as unallocated funds. For our example, this means that the sheet would subtract $48,000 from the $60,000 total budget allocation, reflecting $12,000 of unallocated funds. We are also updating the self-directed budget sheet instruction guidance to include these three updates that we shared today, and that will be posted next week on the self-directed services dedicated webpage. Next slide, please. This slide has two screenshots of a person's self-directed budget sheet that was created using the March 2021 reference date. So all participants self-directing as of today will have this version for their self-directed budget sheet. Similar to the last slide, this example shows that the person's total DDA approved budget allocation in the amount of $60,000. It also shows the total budget sheet cost as $48,000. Again, it's noted above the words check sum in our current budget sheet form. To determine unallocated funds for participants currently with their budget sheets approved and authorized, the participant, with the support of their team, can subtract the DDA self-directed budget allocation from the self-directed budget sheet figure to come up with the unallocated funding. As you see here on the screen, we've noted those calculations that could be done. If we subtract the two figures, 60,000 minus 48,000 in the budget sheet, we see that there would be a $12,000 savings or remaining unallocated funding for this budget. Next slide, please. So now we're going to start to talk about the DDA COVID budget modification. And you may recall that we have issued guidance on this that's been in place for the last couple of years. Due to the public health emergency, the DDA temporarily changed the budget modification process to support immediate health and safety needs, which is noted in the Appendix K guidance and is set to end as of June 30th of 2022. Under the Appendix K flexibilities, budget modifications can be made within the approved budgets. As noted on the screen, our current guidance notes, without DDA's prior authorization, a participant with the support of their team may move funding across approved budget service lines as long as they remain within their total approved budget amount, including changes within current services authorized by the DDA and changes from current services authorized to a new service covered by the program for which the participant is enrolled. Note, we have noted one exception on this slide, and that relates to requesting personal supports, overnight supports as a new service. New personal supports, overnight services requests must be requested using the revised or annual PCP process as per the department memo from Deputy Secretary Shu and Deputy Secretary Simon and policy. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the update to the modification process so that we can support the use and accessing of unallocated funding. After receiving requests for a process to access unallocated funding without needing to do a revised PCP and consulting with a stakeholder focus group that included participants, family members, coordinators of community services, support brokers, and fiscal management services representatives, and in consideration of some concerns shared by an FMS, the DDA has issued guidance on accessing unallocated funding without needing to do a revised PCP. And so specifically the guidance today that we have available on the website, and we have links at the end of our presentation, will state that without DDA's prior authorization, participants with the support of their team may use up to $5,000 of unallocated budget funding from their total budget, as long as they remain within their total approved budget amount. This includes changes within current services authorized by the DDA and changes from current services authorized to a new service covered by the waiver program for which the participant is enrolled. Requests to use unallocated funding above the $5,000 can be made and would be considered. Those need to be submitted to the DDA regional office, who will review it. Again, similar to what we shared on the last slide, the one exception relates to personal supports, overnight supports as a new service, as per the recent memo and policy. For those seeking personal supports, overnight supports, they need to work with their team for a person-centered planning process to ensure that they request that through a revised or annual process. As shared during our overview, the person-centered planning process and budget allocation, participants' person-centered plans have been created up to 2 times during the public health emergency if you've been a participant for some time. And services reflected in your person-centered plan should be reflective of your current needs and current community engagement. Again, if at any time an urgent or emergency needs arise, the coordinator of community services and regional office should be contacted and a revised emergency person-centered plan can be created. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit more about accessing those unallocated funding. We are sharing and issuing the written guidance today to support access to these funds through the budget modification process. The revised DDA COVID Form number 5 and process will be used to access these unallocated funding until June 30th of 2022. All requests must be within the scope of the DDA waiver, policy and guidance, and that includes the Appendix K guidance. We note here on our screen that the best practice for completing budget modifications is for the participant and their team to meet to discuss the needs for modification and complete the form together. Again, it is important for the team to discuss to ensure any potential conflict of interest are addressed. Examples could be family of staff or support brokers seeking hours or funding. The Appendix K budget modification shall remain in effect until the next PCP. What we mean by here is that once that budget modification has been approved through this process, it can continue after June 30th until the next plan is created. Next slide, please. On this slide, we note that the participant and their team, including that coordinator of community services and fiscal management services provider, are responsible for identifying and confirming those unallocated budget sheet funding, for ensuring all requests are within the scope of the DDA waiver, policy and guidance, including Appendix K, and ensuring that the total authorized budget is not exceeded. Next slide, please. On this slide, we have a screenshot of the revised DDA COVID Form number 5. It's been updated with the reference date of April 8th, 2022. The form has been revised to include the DDA Self-Directed Services Budget Allocation. That's your total allocation from your person-centered plan. It also includes the DDA Self-Directed Services Budget Sheet total. That's the total that you get when you create your budget sheet and noting your staff wages, benefits, and vendor rates. And it will also include the self-directed services unallocated funding. Today we shared how participants, with the support of their team, can determine unallocated funding using the self-directed budget sheet. We talked about the March version and also the new revised April version. Teams can also use the updated DDA COVID Form number 5 form to enter the DDA budget allocation noted in the detailed service authorization of the person-centered plan, or the self-directed budget sheet, and the total self-directed budget sheet. And the revised form will automatically calculate the total unallocated funds. To support quick access to the revised DDA COVID Form number 5, we have included it in the revised self-directed budget sheet as a specific tab, and we've also posted it to the dedicated Appendix K webpage. Therefore, participants, with the support of their team, coordinators of community services, can access it in 2 ways. Again, we have included it in the revised self-directed budget sheet as a specific tab and also posted it to the Appendix K website. Next slide, please. So this is some screenshots of the revised Appendix K Form 5 with the updated April 2022. As is in the current practice, Section 1 includes 2 tables. And so the box on the left is related to services being reduced. We have added to that box services being reduced or taken from unallocated funds to this section to indicate the use of unallocated funds. When accessing unallocated funds, the W code text field should be left blank. The services box should be noted as unallocated funding. For the amount box, you insert the unallocated funding amount to support the services being increased or added as applicable per the DDA operated waiver programs, policy, and guidance. If applicable, the taxes could also be noted in your unallocated funding. The total cost data field will automatically total based on the information entered above. The box on the right relates to services being increased or added. So this section notes the increase or the new services for which the use of the unallocated funds are going to be used. There is no change to this box. The W code would be entered for the specific service for which is being increased or added. The services would be inserted, so the service name or details as applicable. You will indicate whether it is a new service by entering Y for yes or N for no if it's an existing service. For the amount, you insert the associated funding amount. And if it's a staff-related service, you'll need to note the taxes in the tax section. And as with the other section, the total cost for this data fill will automatically total based on the information noted above. Therefore, the total cost noted under the services being reduced or taken from unallocated funds section must equal the total cost noted under the services being increased or added section. Next slide, please. As with the current process, the form is signed by the participant and their legal guardian as applicable. We've included a screenshot of that on this slide. The form is submitted to the participant's fiscal management service provider for processing, and it's important that a copy should be provided to all team members so that they're all aware of the request and can be prepared to support the monitoring and use of funds. As with the current process related to budget modifications under Appendix K, the FMS provider may approve that request for use of unallocated funds when the request is associated with the immediate direct support staff or services needed during our COVID-19 crisis to ensure the health and safety of the person. The service and items are allowable under the DDA operated Medicaid programs or Appendix K flexibility. The service or items do not exceed the limits under the DDA operated waiver programs or the Appendix K flexibility. And the total cost noted under the services being reduced or taken from unallocated fund section must equal the total cost under the services being added section. The FMS, as with the current practice, may deny a request to use unallocated funding when the request is not associated with the need for direct support staff or services during COVID public health emergency. The service or items are not allowable under the DDA operated waiver programs or Appendix K flexibilities. The services and items exceed the limits under the DDA operated waiver programs or Appendix K flexibilities. And the total cost noted under the services being reduced or taken from unallocated fund section does not equal the total cost for services increased under the added section. The FMS provider shall send a copy of the DDA COVID Form 5 to all team members and include a copy of it with an updated statement as soon as the modification is applied. If the FMS provider determines that they should deny the request based on the standards noted in the existing guidance and continued in the updated guidance, the DDA regional office will review that determination. If the DDA determines that the denial was proper, DDA will issue notice of its decision, its legal fact and factual basis as applicable with appeal rights as required by the state government, and that will be shared with the participant. Next slide, please. We've also added an additional optional tracker for unallocated funds to the DDA COVID Form number 5. This can be used by participants and their teams to track their unallocated funds use. It is noted at the bottom of the form. To complete this tool, the total unallocated funds is entered on the unallocated fund amount in the box reference on the left. For date used, the participant with support of their team can enter the date of the DDA COVID Form 5. If multiple budget modifications are used, they can record all of them in this tracking tool so that they can have a current balance of available unallocated funding. For unallocated fund use, you would enter the amount of funding being used for the associated COVID Form 5 budget modification and reference date, and the remaining unallocated funds will then automatically calculate based on the funding noted under the unallocated fund use. Again, participants, with the support of their team, need to track and monitor funding to ensure they stay within their budget and do not exceed or overexpend. So in the event that more than one budget modification is needed between now and the end of the Appendix K flexibility, this is a tool that can be used by the participant and their team members. Next slide, please. On this slide, we have a screenshot of service limitation reminders, which have been added in the guidance that we're sharing today. This was suggested when we met with a stakeholder work group to include some of those reminders for service limitations so that teams would have a quick reference as they're developing budget modifications. Please note that it's important to also refer to the DDA operated federally approved Medicaid waiver programs and Appendix K flexibilities for additional information and requirements. In addition, DDA has noted information in the policies, which are available by accessing our website and clicking on the policy stat link. As you can see on the chart, and you'll see in the guidance, we've indicated if the limitation is specific to the waiver and if there was any additional flexibility provided due to Appendix K. As we are currently under the Appendix K, those flexibilities and opportunities to exceed those limits are available through the end of June 30th, 2022. Now I'm happy to turn this over to Kristi, who's going to walk us through and share some examples of completing the form related to a budget modification. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Rhonda. Hope everybody is having a lovely Friday afternoon. We're going to share an example with you to show how a person and their team may complete the COVID Form 5 form to access unallocated funds. In this scenario, J. Doe has $60,000 in their DDA self-directed budget allocation for their PCP authorized services and has budgeted $48,000 in their self-directed budget sheet. By entering these figures into the revised form, it automatically calculated to reveal that J has $12,000 in unallocated funds. Next slide. Jay goes to a day program for about 8 hours on weekdays. Jay is informed that the day program has closed for 6 weeks because of a COVID outbreak. Jay and their team don't want to go without community-based services during this time. So Jay and their team decide to move money from unallocated funds to a new line item, community development services. Jay wants to hire a neighbor to provide these services for $25 an hour. The team meets together to work on a budget modification and does the math calculations together. You'll see those in the box at the bottom of the slide. 8 hours of community development services for Monday through Friday for 6 weeks totals 240 hours. 240 hours times that $25 an hour is $6,000. Jay and their team need to consider employer taxes too at the 14% of the $6,000, which is $840. In total, Jay and their team will need to move $6,840 from unallocated funds. The team works together to make sure the total cost in the reduced or taken from unallocated and being increased or added columns is the same. Section 1 of the form is completed as shown on the slide. Under services being reduced or taken from unallocated funds, they note unallocated funds in the service box and add $6,840 into the amount beside it. The form automatically calculates and notes that figure for the total cost. Under the services being increased or added, they enter the Community Development Service W code from the budget spreadsheet W1993 community development services as the service, Y or yes to indicate it is a new service being accessed, and then note the CDS amount of $6,000 for the 6 weeks and the additional $840 for taxes. The form again automatically adds these figures for a total of 6,840. As shown in our example, the total cost of services being reduced or taken from unallocated funds equals the total cost of services being increased or added. Next slide. Jay signs the form, which is shared with team members and sent to the DDA Self-Directed Services Regional Office Lead for review, because this request is over the $5,000 price point. Next slide. Jay and their team decide to use the optional tracking tool to note the request so that they can determine the remaining unallocated funds in the event that Jay has another service need. As shown in the example, Jay and their team list the $12,000 in unallocated funds they had. Then note the date they completed this modification and the amount they used. Jay and their team can now see that there's $5,160 left in unallocated funds. Next slide. Back over to Rhonda.
Great, thank you, Kristi. Really appreciate that. So just to summarize what we've talked about today, the self-directed budget sheet has been revised and it's posted live on the website today. The revised DDA COVID form number 5 and process will continue to be used to access now up to $5,000 of unallocated funding until June 30th, 2022, which is the end of the Appendix K flexibility. The DDA can approve the use of unallocated funds above $5,000. All requests must be within the scope of the DDA waivers, the Appendix K, policy, and guidance. The best practice for completing budget modifications is for the participant and their team to meet to discuss the needs for a modification and complete the form together. The Appendix K budget modifications shall remain in effect until the next PCP, whether it's initial, revised, or annual. Next slide, please. Here's the updated resources that are available today on the DDA website. So here are quick links for you to be able to click on to access them. Next slide, please. And now we're going to go into questions and answer. So again, as Donna noted, feel free to share a question in the question box. It'll be on your right-hand side. So starting at the beginning, we have a note or comment that says, with the ARC, we receive the budget summary monthly. However, with MedSource, it is a challenging situation to get the budget summary. Is there something the DDA can do so we can get them more regularly? So thank you for sharing that. We're happy to follow up with the FMS related to your concern. Feel free also to reach out to the self-directed leads for assistance, but we will follow up on your concern there. The next question is, are PCPs in progress allowed to use the previous budget format so work does not have to be redone? Absolutely. The the March 2021 version that teams have been working on, continue to use those and move them forward. Just note that the calculations of unallocated funds would not be at the top, and the addition of the tax line and the personal supports, overnight supports line would not be noted on those, but you can absolutely continue to use them. And we know there will be a transition as those forms start to transition and fade out. We had another question is, does the client have access to the unallocated funds? What is it for? Thanks. So thank you for sharing that question. As we talked today, the unallocated funds up to $5,000 can be submitted using the current COVID budget modification process for items to support direct staffing needs or other items and services based on the person's assessed need now. And they can work with their teams, as we talked about today, using this revised form to make that request. Again, the end of the presentation, we have direct links to the written guidance that reviews what we talked about today, in addition to those forms. Next question. How will the budget sheet be populated if the participant is transitioning from a traditional service to self-directed services, and the budget amount used by the agency must be subtracted from the approved budget to get the actual operational budget amount, which would be the approved amount to start? So that's an interesting question. And from my perspective, when a person transitions from the traditional service model to the self-directed model, they then create a self-directed person-centered plan. And so for that plan will then establish information related to their budget. I do know that on the person's plan, it may include services, if it's during a revised plan, that were noted under the traditional. And then when you transition, those services are typically ended and can be subtracted from that. So we'll look at that and see if there's a way we can support determining that in an easy way. The next question is, will the review of over $5,000 require a person-centered plan revision? Kristi, you want to take that question?
Yes. So when a person right now during our pandemic, so when we're using that COVID Form 5, if it's over $5,000, it just needs to be reviewed by the self-directed lead. They may have questions for the person and their team regarding why. So they might be working with you on a PCP revision, but they might not, kind of depending on the need. So that is the purpose. So those requests over $5,000 go to our leads for further review, and they may need to talk with you more. I hope that answers that question.
Yep, great, Kristi, thanks. And interesting that the next question was for requests over $5,000. Does the CCS email the self-directed regional director or the assigned reviewer? So as Kristi just said, and you'll see in the guidance, that form should be submitted to the DDA self-directed service lead staff. So it doesn't go to the regional director, it goes to the self-directed services lead staff, not the assigned reviewer. The emails for our DDA regional office self-directed leads are all noted in the guidance so that you can easily look at them, and they're happy to assist with any questions you have. Kristi, the next question says, can the unallocated funds be used for environmental changes? So I'm thinking they're thinking about environmental mods. What's your thoughts on that?
Yep. Health and safety and assessed need. Just like we have been using the COVID-5 form already, if there is a assessed need, as listed in our limitations, I think that the guidance also has that chart from the slides that has all of the limitations that Appendix K allows. So maybe, if it's a health and safety assessed need.
Right, and you want to work with your team, right? And if you have an assessed need for that, you can submit the request. Again, we've got the guidance and the services and limitation noted in the form. Our next question is, if a participant does not have money in emergency backup staff taxes and has an emergency is deemed to be under $5,000, can you use that unallocated funds? Would this be considered a new service, or would it be, and would it need to be approved? So that's a really good question. From my perspective, yes, you can use this process to allocate funds for Emergency backup taxes. Kristi kind of shared her example with maybe needing to change or increase services because of an outbreak or such. So yes, the Form 5 can be used to note funding for emergency backup staff taxes. The next question is, please tell people where to find the W codes. Kristi, can you help us to know where we can find those W codes?
They are listed on the very left-hand side of all the budget spreadsheets. The budget spreadsheet from March 2021 and the budget spreadsheet that we just issued today. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And so when you look at the budget sheet, it'll have the specific service name, right? Personal support, support broker, community development services, employment services, and such. And on the far left side of that, for that row, it will include what we call a W code. It's associated with some of the billing that the fiscal management services providers use. Okay, our next question is, to which email DDA should the COVID-5 be sent if requesting more than $5,000 in unallocated funds? Kristi, you want to share?
Yes, those requests should be sent directly to the self-directed leads in the region. In our guidance at the very bottom, we have a list of them. I'll read them out so that you guys know where they should be going. For Central Region, you can email them to Ola or Rashawn. Their emails are listed in the question. For the Eastern Region, you can email it to Jonna. For the Southern Region, to Tia, and for the Western Region, to Kara. And all of their emails and information are listed at on the last page of our guidance.
Great, thank you, Kristi. Our next question is about the COVID Form 5, and it's asking about why Section 2 says 2,000 versus 5,000. So Kristi, can you talk a little bit about the difference between Section 1 and Section 2 and why Section 2 is referencing $2,000?
I can. So if you recall, very early in the pandemic, when we first issued this COVID-5 form, the DDA authorized a $2,000 in additional funding in everyone's budget who self-direct, should they need it. So Section 2 does account for that $2,000. It's the additional funds. When we think about Section 1, we're thinking about funds that have been approved in someone's in their approved authorized budget allocation. So that's the difference between the 2,000 and 5,000. 2,000 is additional money outside of someone's budget allocation, and the $5,000 before someone. Let me be clear. Regardless of a person in Section 1 can ask for more than $5,000. It just needs to be approved by the self-direction regional staff. But it's just that cap has to do with reviewing. The $2,000 is the additional funding. I hope that makes sense.
Right. So just to recap what Kristi's saying is Section 1 allows the ability to move funding from line items you currently are authorized from services to services authorized or to new services. Today, we've introduced that you can also use Section 1 to use unallocated funds in the person's total budget to services already authorized or to a new service. Section 2 is specific to the Appendix K flexibility, where the DDA authorized $2,000 additional to people's self-directed budget due to the public health emergency to meet specific items that are still available today, with the exception of one. And so Section 2 is that $2,000 additional dollars that we added to everybody's budget, versus Section 1 is your existing budget, whether it's authorized line item or utilizing unallocated funding. So the next question is, for clarity, does this mean that unallocated funds can be moved to individual and family directed goods and services through a budget modification if the amount is under $5,000. So the answer to this question is yes, you can use the COVID budget modification form to move funds to access the individual and family directed goods and services. Please note that there are existing limitations related to individual and family directed goods and services. So if you're already utilizing some funding for them, you need to stay within the approved limit within the waiver program. And again, that is noted in our guidance in our waiver programs. The next question is, will unallocated fund use be indicated on the FMS statement? From my understanding, the FMS would utilize the addition of the unallocated funding, add that to your monthly statement, but I do not know if they plan to alter their monthly statement to also include unallocated funding. I think that that's part of the person-centered team process that could be used to support the participant. Kristi, do you have any suggestions on ways people can be supported in terms of monitoring their budget and knowing about those unallocated funds?
Definitely. So on the COVID-5 form, we have two sections for this reason. So we have the first section, which automatically calculates a person's unallocated funding should they have those numbers available. We mentioned earlier on in our presentation that the unallocated funds can be found through through your CCS, through the detailed service authorization process or your budget allocation. And then as you create your budget as a team, you would know your total self-directed budget sheet funding. And so our new budget spreadsheet calculates that, but also the COVID-5 form does. So once you figure out that dollar amount, you can continually use the optional tracking tool at the bottom of the COVID-5 form with your team. My suggestion is always that best practice for budget modifications is that they are done with your entire team all together, working the math together, inputting those numbers into the spreadsheet together so everyone knows what's happening. And so there is as much accountability as possible as you continue to monitor those allocated funds.
Thank you, Kristi. The next question is, why would the allocation be different from the budget? Can you review with us what the DDA budget allocation is compared to the self-directed services budget sheet? Do you want me to repeat that, or you want me to take that one?
Oh, yes, take that. I'm so sorry.
Okay, sure. No, sure. So I think we're using the word allocation a lot today. And so let's just review what we're talking about. When a person has a person-centered plan created, the plan will include specific services, associated units, and then a rate is applied to that to create a budget or a cost per service. The cost per services are then all added together, and it creates a total budget allocation that is used by participants who are self-directing. With that budget allocation, and in our example today, let's say our total person-centered plan cost of all the services equates to $60,000. The participant then, using their employer and budget authority under the self-directed service delivery model, creates a form called the self-directed budget sheet. So this is their own personal budget indicating the use of those $60,000 that DDA has authorized as their budget allocation. With that $60,000, they're going to go through and complete the self-directed budget sheet, noting the services that were authorized in their person-centered plan for the units that they have been authorized. But they get to set staff wages within the DDA's reasonable and customary standards. They can determine if they're going to offer benefits to their employees. They can also note the items for, let's say, assistive technology, environmental mods and such, and they would note those specific costs. If they're going to use a vendor or a provider, the budget sheet also includes line items where they can note that and note the specific rate that they're going to pay their vendor or provider. Similar to the staff wages, DDA has issued guidance on reasonable and customary rates for vendors and providers. Once the participant, with the support of their team if they choose, creates and notes that information on the budget sheet, it is then totaled up. The budget sheets are created to do this calculation automatically for the participant. That total, as is our example today, may equate to less than the total DDA budget allocation. So for today, we demonstrated that when the person completed their budget sheet, the total cost equated to $48,000. Therefore, if we subtracted the money that was allocated by DDA, the DDA self-directed budget allocation, the big budget of $60,000, and we subtract the $48,000, which is the individual budget sheet that the participant has created based on their decision about staff wages, benefits, and rates, we see that the person would then have $12,000 unallocated. You can think of it almost as a saving that they have, that if they needed to access because of changes in their service needs or decisions related to wages and such, they could tap into that savings or unallocated funding that is noted for this person, an example of $12,000. And so our current guidance and process and policy outside Appendix K is noted that you would need to complete a revised plan to complete and access that information. We have updated the flexibility under Appendix K to now provide the opportunity for people to easily access up to $5,000 of those unallocated funding without having to go through a full revised person-centered planning process. So I hope that helps to explain. And again, the webinar is recorded and we've got the written guidance in addition to the PowerPoint that can be reviewed. Next question. Okay. Just going through and reviewing to see if we've answered some of these. Next question, is this change effective today or for a future date? Kristi, you want to share your thoughts on that?
So we just updated the COVID Form 5. It is effective today. Yeah, but again, the process, the form is just an updated one. You may still use the COVID Form 5 to move funding from line items that already exist. As you have been doing, we've just added this additional ability to access unallocated funds.
Great, thank you. And then we have a question, when a person starts services with DDA for the first time and plans to self-direct using the self-directed model, are there any limitations to the budget amount? And so hopefully that overview we just shared in terms of how that budget is created, that gives you the total DDA budget allocation that is then used by the participant to create their self-directed budget sheet. There are limits in terms of specific services, and we've included that in a quick review in our guidance that we're sharing. And so please note in that there are some flexibilities referred to as Appendix K that are available through the end of June, but will not continue. And again, when you are creating a person-centered plan based on those unmet assessed needs, the DDA is authorizing those services and service levels, let's say 20 hours of community development services based on the assessed need. And so we really should be seeing in your budget sheet those 20 hours of community support or community development services so that would be in alignment. But yes, services do have some specific limitations, and you should refer to slide 20 in our presentation that notes them in addition to the guidance on the web page. So I know we've come to 1 o'clock. Kristi and I would like to thank you for joining us today. We hope that this information is helpful for you as we look to provide an update to the self-directed budget sheet, and also to provide information and updates related to the COVID modification form, Form 5. Again, the recording will be posted on the webpage, and we appreciate your time. So thank you, stay safe, and we look forward to talking to you next time.